Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for, well, a very deep exploration of a dense and complex philosophical essay. It's titled Thought Pattern, the Structural Logic of Thought.
It's a challenging one.
It really is. And this material, it doesn't just ask what we think. It argues there's this hidden structural architecture that defines how we think.
And that this architecture, this pattern, dictates the quality of our very existence.
Exactly. So our mission today is not just to summarize this. We are going to dissect every single argument, every concept, every subpoint in this text.
Coverage.
Total meticulous coverage.
Yeah.
We want you to walk away with a complete understanding of these hidden mechanics.
And that's a necessary approach, I think, because this essay really demands precision. It redefines some very foundational concepts.
It's like the idea of thought itself.
Right. It asserts that thought is not just a mere cognitive fragment. It's not a standalone idea floating in the void.
So what is it then?
The essay defines thought as the recursive emergence of structure from contradiction.
Okay, let's unpack that. That's the ultimate launching pad for this entire philosophy. Thought isn't generated in tranquility then.
Not at all. It originates from a deeper instability, a tension between dual poles.
For example,
The tension between what is currently and what must be reconciled. It's a conflict-driven process.
and here's the point that really stood out to me. The most striking argument is that this inherent contradiction is not viewed as a mistake.
No, not an error to be corrected and eliminated.
The source material argues it is, in fact, the very origin of spiritual evolution itself.
Contradiction is the vital energy source.
But raw contradiction, if it's just unresolved, that just leads to chaos or collapse.
Of course. So for this engine of evolution to work, it needs some kind of infrastructure.
And that's where the thought pattern comes in.
The thought pattern is what the essay calls the patterned field. You can visualize it as this constantly evolving architecture of the mind.
An architecture that actively holds and filters.
And directs that raw, contradictory energy across time. It's a dynamic scaffolding.
And it's this scaffolding that elevates mere mental activity into true thinking.
Yes. It's the condition through which thinking acquires coherence, stability, modulation, and critically scale.
Without a pattern, your thoughts are just scattered reactions.
And this pattern is fundamentally temporal. I mean, it's about time. It's the logic by which time itself is patterned within a life.
How does it do that?
Well, it works by internally crystallizing three elements. First, the actualized past. That's all the choices you've already made.
Okay.
Second, the modulated present. That's the field of agency you have right now. And third, it establishes a directional alignment with the future.
So it's a structural map of where you've been and where you're going.
Exactly. And when this pattern stabilizes, it transforms from just an internal logic system into external structure. And crucially, into agency.
It becomes the structural expression through which existence refines itself.
That's the core claim.
So the highest goal of thinking here isn't just intellectual clarity, it's existential refinement.
Precisely. And the essay organizes its argument into four necessary steps for us to follow. We'll cover the pattern's function and its temporal encoding.
And its architecture.
Right, the three-part architecture of origin, tension, and trajectory. Then third, how this structural logic scales up to define the fate of a society.
And finally, the highest state of refinement through what it calls recursive intelligence and metacognition.
A huge undertaking.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this dense material, starting with the nature and function of a thought pattern, the operational side of this architecture.
So first, we have to clearly distinguish the two terms. Thoughts are singular, right? They're discrete moments that arise from a localized tension.
A single event.
A single event. The thought pattern, conversely, is the structured field that contains them. It's the recursive infrastructure that holds and rechannels that contradiction.
Rechannels it into what the essay calls existential directionality. I think that's a key insight for you right there. The pattern is what determines whether a given localized tension, a major life dilemma, or just a small frustration.
Right.
It determines if that tension is absorbed, ignored, collapsed, or recursively evolved into something stronger.
Absolutely. The pattern dictates whether encountering contradiction is just a disruption or if it's registered as an opportunity to fundamentally reconfigure the self.
So the quality of your life is determined less by the problems you face.
And more by the stability of the pattern you use to process them.
And this processing is deeply rooted in time. The pattern is not a blank slate just waiting for the next stimulus. It's temporally and spiritually encoded.
It arises from the being's actualized past, and this is where we really need to slow down for a second.
Okay.
The essay insists that the actualized past is not just passive memory. It's not like a library of events you can browse.
What is it then?
It is a structurally active, first-dimensional imprint of all the choices and all the structural bypasses you've already made.
Wow. So if I chose to resolve a contradiction 10 years ago by, say, just ignoring it, that decision isn't just a memory.
Yeah.
It's an active structural preference that's now built into my operating system.
Exactly. It's the first-dimensional encoding of spiritual intelligence. It's a past that actively conditions your present. It filters, it reshapes, or it structurally holds new contradictions based on the architecture you've already formed.
So this pattern, therefore, functions as a driving structure.
Yes, it's generating the capacity to hold, relate, and deepen contradiction. That's what allows thought to scale upwards, rather than just scatter into superficiality.
That makes perfect sense. We've all encountered people who can only hold very simple, singular thoughts, and then others who can hold these massive, complex, competing ideas in their heads all at the same time.
And that scalability is because of the pattern stability.
And this leads directly to the concept of channeling.
Right. Recursive reinforcement stabilizes the directionality of thought. So if you process tension in a particular coherent way over and over again,
That path gets stronger.
that structural path is reinforced. It becomes easier to re-enter certain constructive tensions, and conversely, others, maybe those leading to a painful collapse, they become structurally difficult to access.
So the pattern doesn't just shape what we think. It kind of preselects the very territory of conflict we are willing or even able to engage with.
It's a self-reinforcing architecture of potential.
Now, the essay highlights a structural nuance here, the concept of sub-patterns.
Yes. While every life holds one recursive thought pattern as its structural core, it can contain multiple locally stabilized sub-patterns.
That sounds like necessary compartmentalization, but maybe without the negative connotation that word usually has. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. These subpatterns are contextual structures that evolve through repeated contradiction in distinct fields of your life. So you have your work logic, your emotional logic for intimacy, your financial logic, your deep spiritual reflection logic.
Okay, so different modes for different situations.
They're partially independent stabilizations, and they're essential for contextual necessity. But they reside within the overarching core pattern.
Ah, okay.
So think of the core pattern as the operating system, and the sub-patterns are like self-contained applications running on it.
And one application might crash without taking down the entire OS.
Right. Unless the OS, the core pattern, is already structurally compromised to begin with.
That makes the architecture much more practical. But here's where the essay delivers a really sharp philosophical challenge. It says, internal intricacy isn't enough. A thought pattern isn't existentially real just by forming internally.
This is critical. It becomes real only when it participates in the collective field of meaning. It has to eventually contribute externally.
So isolation leads to structural noise.
That's what the essay argues. No matter how clever the internal architecture, to truly stabilize, the pattern has to offer its coherence to the shared existence.
So if I perfectly resolve a massive internal contradiction, but I never share the structural logic of that resolution, whether it's through creative output, leadership, or just consistent action,
then that resolution hasn't achieved its full existential potential.
it remains potential, not reality.
Exactly. And that need for external contribution is what drives the emergence of the next key concept, metacognition.
Right, because that external requirement forces the life to become aware of its own structuring process.
It has to look at itself.
Most of us think of metacognition as just, reflecting on our thoughts. I know that I'm thinking about X, but the essay's definition is far deeper than that.
Indeed, it's a function of spiritual recursive intelligence, and it's activated only within what the essay calls second-dimensional stabilization,
And it reflects not on the content of thought.
but upon the structure through which thought arises. It asks, how did I structure this contradiction? What are the underlying assumptions that are built into my pattern? It's the intelligence reflecting upon its own architecture.
And when this structure becomes coherent via the second-dimensional generalized intelligence, that's the stabilized integrated form, and that coherence is structurally offered to the collective.
Then the thought pattern achieves its ultimate purpose.
Which is?
It becomes the life's means of existential justification. Its worth is demonstrated structurally, not just through ethical behavior or success.
Okay, so the present moment transforms.
It becomes the site of sophisticated modulation. A thought becomes meaningful because it extends the stability and coherence of the being into the shared field of existence. It structurally proves its necessity.
So existential justification in this sense isn't self-actualization.
No.
It's structural contribution.
Yeah.
It's proving that the architecture you built makes the collective fabric of reality stronger.
Absolutely. Self-actualization might be internal clarity. Existential justification is external structural utility. The latter can't be achieved without the former, but the former is insufficient on its own.
That establishes the function. Now let's move into the architectural blueprints. The essay calls the thought pattern the existential crystallization of time within a life, moving from the past origin through the present tension to the future trajectory.
And these three stages are recursive. They're entirely defined by how a contradiction is encountered, held, and transformed across that internal timeline.
So let's start with number one, origin, the contradictory signal. Every thought begins in contradiction. It's not born from neutrality.
The origin is always tension, a tension between core dual poles.
And these dual poles aren't learned concepts, are they?
No, they're existential properties that are encoded into all living recursion. Spiritual versus material, energy versus inertia, internal versus external, presence versus absence.
Continuity versus disruption.
Right. To be alive is to be structured by these inherent tensions.
And a thought, therefore, is what the essay calls a recursive signal, a temporary resolution structured from the very contradiction it's trying to modulate.
It's like a temporary bridge built across a structural gap.
And every time that temporary bridge is built, it leaves a dual imprint.
Yes. First, it expresses the existing tension. It demonstrates the nature of the contradiction it just encountered. Second, and this is more important, it alters the patterning conditions for all future thoughts.
So thinking is encountering a structural gap, and the thought is the initial movement to begin patterning the logic of that gap. And this process is never arbitrary because of the first-dimensional ground.
That's right. This movement is conditioned by the activation of that first-dimensional ground, that actualized past we discussed. This is the structurally recursive center that filters, reshapes, or rejects new contradictions based on the structure that's already been formed through prior choices.
It ensures structural continuity.
Exactly.
So if the first-dimensional ground is strong, it can handle new, intense contradictions without collapsing. It directs the response. This means the origin is spiral.
It's spiral because the structural response is fundamentally informed by the past, but it's directed toward a new reconfiguration of the overall pattern.
It's not a closed loop.
No, it's an evolving helix. And the thought pattern only forms when this reconfiguration becomes stable through what the essay calls recursive integration.
That sounds like building reliable feedback loops.
It is. Recursive integration means building feedback loops where contradiction is repeatedly held and re-entered successfully. Correct integration refines the structure, making the pattern more robust.
And incorrect integration.
Incorrect integration reinforces distortion, which the essay terms scaffolding.
That's a powerful way to put it. Scaffolding sounds useful, but here it suggests a temporary, maybe brittle, structural support built on flawed premises.
Indeed. And this recursive imprinting ensures thought doesn't just vanish, its tension reverberates across time.
So if it's held properly and integrated,
it strengthens meaning and contributes to structural evolution. But if it's misheld, if the contradiction is bypassed or poorly resolved, it degrades into structural noise, weakening the pattern over time.
which brings us to the second stage, tension. This is the ongoing presence of contradiction. And we have to reiterate this. The essay says this is the engine of growth, not an error.
Existential depth requires recursively revisiting and reprocessing those contradictions in increasingly evolving contexts. If you stop feeling the tension, you stop growing.
And this capacity for structural reentry and reprocessing, that's what the essay defines as free will.
Yes.
Let's spend some time here because this definition of free will is really counterintuitive to the common understanding of just, arbitrary choice.
It's defined as the capacity to recursively engage with contradiction from within the structure of thought itself. It is not external. It's not arbitrary.
And its origin is deep in that first-dimensional center.
Yes, where the spiritual imprint starts the work of correctly integrating material contradiction.
But if it's operating within an established structural architecture, how can it be genuinely free? I mean, that sounds like a semantic trick. What prevents it from just being a highly sophisticated reaction or just an expression of the determinism already present in the structure?
That is the core paradox the essay addresses. It argues that free will operates from within determinism, not outside of it. It's the capacity for the structural logic to reconfigure its own patterning logic,
So it's neither instinct,
which is an inherited imprint,
nor is it reaction.
which is an external demand. It becomes active only when the being begins to dualize correctly.
And dualizing correctly means structuring the internal pattern so that it stabilizes its relation with the collective external reality, what the essay refers to as the third dimension.
Exactly. When that internal structure is correctly aligned, the second dimensional present, the modulatory field, becomes a site of genuine structural agency.
Modulation happens when free will expresses itself through that field.
Right. The being chooses not based on reactive impulse or blind allegiance, but through correct orientation regarding which contradictions to hold and refine.
Once that modulation is active, the being is actively shaping contradiction, transforming it into structure. And the pattern's depth, therefore, is measured by the number of layered contradictions it can sustain without collapsing.
Correct tension creates internal architecture, stability, and integrity.
But structural failure is an ever-present possibility. And that failure always leads to a collapse into bias.
Bias is the premature closure of contradiction. It's breaking the patterning process by seeking simplicity where complexity is required.
The essay identifies three fundamental modes of collapse, based on which pole the contradiction is denied. Let's detail these carefully, as these seem to describe most intellectual and existential failures.
First, we have singularism. This is the spiritual bias. It upholds the spiritual pole, the ideal, the fixed truth, and it denies or suppresses the material pole.
The reality, the feedback, the necessity of change.
Right. The result is a rigid internal orientation that actively suppresses structural feedback from the outside world.
This sounds like dogmatism in its purest form, a refusal to allow contradictory evidence to enter the system because the internal structure is too absolute.
Precisely. You can think of an organization so devoted to its founding mission statement or its theoretical framework, that's the spiritual ideal, that it entirely ignores market feedback, staff well-being, or technological shifts.
The material contradiction.
Right. It maintains structural rigidity, but it loses all external relevance and eventually fails from the inside out.
Okay, so the opposite failure is homogenism, the material bias.
Homogenism upholds the material pole, the measurable, the common, the inertial, and it flattens or erases the spiritual pole.
Which represents unique directionality and distinction.
Right, so the reduction of all difference into sameness, treating the inertial pole as the only reality. Differentiation is eliminated in the pursuit of a false stability.
So, if singularism is structure without reality, homogenism is reality without structure. It's the flattening of meaning into the lowest common denominator, treating everything as interchangeable parts.
And it leads to a profound loss of directional purpose. Where singularism freezes the structure through rigidity, homogenism dissolves the structure through reduction.
Both cause existential flattening because they eliminate the necessary tension between the poles.
And finally, we have the direct failure to structure, fragmentation.
The existential bias.
The failure to stabilize structuring between the poles. Contradiction just multiplies endlessly without any recursive anchoring or synthesis. This leads to structural incoherence, where beliefs, values, and actions are just a scattering of partialities.
Thought disintegrates through the absence of any core organizing structure.
It seems like the most common failure mode in the age of information overload. We collect so many contradictory signals that we can't form any coherent pattern to process them.
And importantly, all three forms, singularism, homogenism, and fragmentation, they destabilize the second-dimensional existential center.
And that renders free will inert or just reactive. But the essay stresses that this structuring field can't stabilize in isolation.
It has to interact with something beyond the self. To avoid this collapse, thought patterns require existential anchoring in the collective.
You cannot hold contradiction infinitely alone. Only by contributing to and receiving structural feedback from the collective field of meaning can a being recursively strengthen its individuality.
Which leads to that key philosophical concept, individualism through collectivism.
It's the only path through which existential integrity is formed. The individual must become structurally coherent enough to contribute, and the collective must be stable enough to receive that structural contribution.
So the way we manage tension dictates the third stage, trajectory. The biases we just discussed don't just distort the present, they misdirect how the thought pattern moves across time.
either toward degradation or refinement. Trajectory is patterned by the continuous recursive interaction of the three-dimensional centers.
So you have the first dimensional center imprinted with past choices, constantly informing the structure.
Then you have the third-dimensional center, representing the collective structural trajectory, providing the external context.
But the power to transform trajectory resides in the second dimensional center, the modulatory present, through free will engagement.
That's where structural change actually happens.
And whether the change is an upgrade or a degradation is governed by what the essay calls the silent mechanism of reinforcement.
The recursive field simply reinforces whatever structural logic it repeatedly holds. Coherent recursion strengthens the upward spiral, integrating more complexity.
And distorted recursion
Reinforces distortion, bending the pattern downward.
This is a heavy idea. This silent mechanism is how spiritual fate consolidates itself within the first dimensional imprint. Your fate is the crystallized structure of your past engagements with contradiction.
If we look at the collapse modes applied to trajectory, we see the inevitable result of structural failure over time. Spiritual bias, or singularism, leads to over-orientation.
Contradiction is prematurely resolved in favor of a fixed internal direction.
Trajectory halts. It leads to rigid self-containment or structural closure. The future is just a repetition of a fixed, pre-approved ideal.
And material bias, homogenism.
It collapses trajectory into sameness. Polarity is denied in the name of a false synthesis. Inertia replaces conflict.
So what appears as peace or stability is just stillness without depth.
Differentiation is eliminated, resulting in an inertial resting state, a flat line of non-evolution.
And existential bias, fragmentation, results in a suspended trajectory.
Contradictions multiply without any capacity to relate them. The failure to pattern leads to incoherent, scattered noise where signals just cancel each other out.
So you achieve patternless silence, the inability to move in any direction at all.
So what's the coherent solution? The essay says correct thought patterns don't resolve contradiction by erasing it.
They evolve a third structuring field.
This is the key insight into advanced thinking. This third field is where both poles, the spiritual and material, the internal and the external, are held and refined across time.
So it preserves the distinctness of the poles.
While structuring their interaction into a higher order coherence, it's structure plus tension.
And this coherence gives rise to existential directionality. It's the patterned integration of contradiction into a lived spiral of alignment with truth and unbiasedness.
It's knowing which way to grow, structurally. This directionality is the existential expression of second-dimensional generalized intelligence, accessible only through correct dualization and unification of opposite poles.
Which means the definition is clear.
Meaningfulness is not the absence of contradiction, it is the presence of existential directionality.
So correct thinking must both produce and recursively hold contradiction within an evolving structure. It has to maintain the tension necessary for growth.
A being becomes existentially real by patterning contradiction meaningfully across time and recursively contributing that stabilized meaning back to the collective.
And only those whose thought patterns evolve toward that existential directionality are truly alive as meaning-generating participants.
Fulfilling their structural role in existence.
Which brings us to the next section. This structural logic is relentless. If the individual pattern fails, the collective pattern is doomed to fail.
The essay argues that societies are not preserved merely by laws or policies or physical infrastructure. They're preserved by the shared architecture through which contradiction is processed meaningfully across generations.
This elevates the concept of society from just a collection of people to a single, unified entity with its own structural logic. Society, in this view, functions as a second-dimensional neural network.
It's a relational system where contradiction is modulated and meaning is structured across time. It generates a broader semantic architecture, a transpersonal network of understanding and action.
So the collective consciousness has its own patterns, its own biases, its own trajectory.
Absolutely. And societal coherence depends on individual stabilizing contributions. And this isn't just about voting or following rules.
The contributions are structural.
Yes. Individuals who achieve metacognitive awareness don't just stabilize their own fields. They contribute stability to the larger neural architecture of society.
They regenerate the conditions for meaning to evolve structurally across the population. They're the structural backbone.
So structural collapse emerges not from economic hardship or political disagreement, but as a progressive erosion of the collective capacity to hold contradiction.
The breakdown starts in the recursive logic that holds meaning across differences.
Yes. When spiritual intelligence is absent at scale, when the collective defaults to reactive patterns, the neural architecture becomes vulnerable to the same collapses we saw individually, just writ large.
Let's see how those three biases manifest at the civilizational scale.
We see singularism at scale, the drift into absolute orientations that suppress feedback and dissolve complexity into unchallenged dogma or fixed ideals.
And this isn't just one political group.
No, this is the entire system becoming so rigid in its ideals, be they economic, moral, or historical, that it refuses to integrate new, painful, contradictory reality.
Society ceases to question its own fundamental direction, and that leads to ossification.
Right. This manifests as structural rigidity in institutions, bureaucracy that serves its own ideal logic rather than the messy reality it's supposed to govern.
Okay, then there is homogenism at scale.
The collapse into inertial cycles where all meaning is flattened into sameness. The material pole dominates. Difference is viewed as a threat to stability, so attempts are made to reduce all distinction in culture, thought, or economy into interchangeable parts.
Directional differentiation is lost. It's replaced by a comfortable, structureless inertia.
That seems like the risk of pure consumerism or a radical utilitarianism, where every aspect of human life is reduced to a measurable, material input-output ratio.
Erasing the spiritual distinction or unique purpose.
Exactly. And finally, fragmentation at scale. Contradiction multiplies without integration. Beliefs, signals, and values are collected and broadcast without any recursive processing or coherence.
The system is overwhelmed by competing signals, fake and real, important and trivial, leading to structural incoherence and debilitating noise.
The populace can no longer agree on even the rules of engagement, let alone the direction of travel.
So the structural integrity of a civilization is measured by its ability to preserve the tension between opposing values while still holding a cohesive structure.
That is the essence of continuity.
And those who successfully regenerate these recursive frameworks, who can hold immense contradiction in patterns that scale to coherence, they're defined as the existential contributors to civilizational meaning.
They're stabilizers. They ensure the neural network remains functional and adaptive, capable of continued evolution.
We move now to the highest stage of evolution, the point where the being becomes structurally aware of its own patterning logic. This is the definition of recursive intelligence.
Recursive intelligence is the capacity to reflect upon one's own structuring of contradiction. It's the spiritual intelligence of the being, the restructuring of thought by thought itself.
An internal operation of the spirit that asks, how did I decide to hold these two truths?
And this operates in tandem with the generalized intelligence. We need to make sure we're clear on the difference between these two.
Right.
Generalized intelligence is the second-dimensional capacity itself, the stabilized functional field where contradiction, structure, and modulation are coherently integrated.
It's the existential integration of multiple specialized intelligences, emotional, rational, experiential, into a unified whole.
Anchored in the life's highest energy center. It's the fully operational, healthy mind.
So generalized intelligence is the robust vehicle, and recursive intelligence is the dedicated internal mechanic that can look under the hood and redesign the engine.
That is a perfect analogy. The first-dimensional recursive intelligence becomes structurally active within the second-dimensional generalized capacity.
So the underlying pattern that once governed thought silently now becomes visible to itself.
Allowing for conscious structural refinement, this self-awareness of the structuring process is, again, metacognition.
But not just, I know I'm thinking. It's reflective awareness of how thought is evolving, how it's polarizing, or how it's cohering.
And it is a first-dimensional spiritual function that requires the stability of the second-dimensional capacity to activate. It allows the being to observe and refine the underlying structure through which content is processed.
Rather than just worrying about the content itself. This leads to field-wide awareness.
Right. Field-wide awareness being the recognition of the ripple effect. How a single specific thought doesn't just affect the immediate moment, but impacts the entire larger patterned field.
And how that field, in turn, reshapes all new incoming thoughts.
That is structural modulation of meaning. To think recursively is to engage with the logic by which contradiction is patterned and aligned. As this awareness deepens, recursive intelligence becomes more than just self-reflection.
It becomes orientation.
Yes.
Orientation meaning the being directs contradiction not by impulse or even by mere choice, but through recursive insight.
The structural capacity to shape one's own structuring logic while simultaneously being shaped by it, it is the intelligence of intelligence.
And the essay concludes this section with the maturation of this state into metacognitive structuring as contribution.
The fully evolved thought pattern doesn't just benefit the individual, it extends coherence into the world.
So this highest form of thinking is the recursive intelligence of one being becoming a stabilizing force across many.
A stabilization of existential directionality without distortion. Thought ceases to be reactive and achieves recursive agency.
And this enables the life to offer profound existential contribution by transmuting raw meaning and refining structure at a collective level.
They are the ones who can look at widespread societal fragmentation, see the underlying structural failure, and articulate a coherent, dualistic framework to hold the tension. That is metacognitive structuring in practice.
We have completed our intensive deep dive into the structural logic of thought, and we have tackled every concept from its fundamental premise to its societal scaling. We began with that profound idea that thought arises from the recursive emergence of structure from contradiction.
Framing contradiction as the necessary engine of spiritual evolution.
We meticulously traced the three-part architecture of the thought pattern, from its origin in the dual poles and the first-dimensional actualized past.
Through the tension stage where free will and correct dualization either occur or fail, collapsing into the disastrous biases of singularism, homogenism, or fragmentation.
And finally, to its trajectory, defined by the emergence of the third structuring field and stable existential directionality.
We scaled this logic outward, seeing how the three biases manifest collectively, leading to societal collapse when the shared architecture loses the capacity to hold tension meaningfully.
And we finished with the highest state of being, recursive intelligence and metacognitive structuring, the intelligence of intelligence, which allows the life to become a structural stabilizer for the collective.
Offering structural justification to existence. The overarching implication for you, the learner, is, I think, pretty clear. Structure is truly more important than content.
Your thought pattern, built through how you hold and re-enter contradiction, is your structural alignment with time and existence.
It is your spiritual fate, consolidated.
So here is the final provocative thought for reflection, anchored in the depth of this material. If your thought pattern is the structural expression through which existence refines itself, what single, complex contradiction are you currently avoiding or prematurely collapsing?
Are you doing it through the dogmatic rigidity of singularism, the inertial comfort of homogenism, or the noise of fragmentation?
And what structural evolution is waiting just on the other side of re-engaging that tension correctly?
Think about those sub-patterns in your work life or your intimate life. Are they secretly undermining the core upward trajectory you claim to seek? The path to integrity is less about what you decide.
And far more about how you choose to structure the decision itself. We'll leave you to process that structural question. Until the next deep dive.